So, Guillaume, the first question from me goes to you, and it's really about looking at the developments of the construction industry. You mentioned a lot issues around sustainability, which is very important, which is very European-centered. But now we are, of course, interested in closing the productivity gap. If we compare ourselves to industry, we have a gap of factor 8, right? And this is quite catastrophic. Where do you see in the market and in the global market, not only European market, developments which gives you hope that the construction industry is able to catch up using new technologies which radically increase productivity?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I actually think those two elements are not entirely disconnected. You're like the environmental regulations and the productivity. But let me answer on the productivity aspect on its own. First, what's happening, I think, is that there's a lot of technologies that are now past the cost threshold to be easily deployed within the construction environment. So decentralization of the different companies and like the fact that they're small and like not working together is definitely a factor of the lack of innovation. But another one has been the fact that working conditions are outdoors in mud and in rain without electricity or cell coverage. And the fact that we have 5G reception everywhere, LiDARs that cost close to nothing, AI that can reconstruct 3D models from just photogrammetry, drones that cost close to nothing. This is the technology gap that is needed to bridge that productivity gap that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Just to give one very, very small example from a company I know and I've been following for a while is a company called AI Clearing, originally based in Poland. And it's simple what they do. They fly drones that look at photogrammetry to figure out construction progress on infrastructure sites and linear sites. And they were, with something that simple, they were able to find enormous differences between what subcontractors were charging and what was actually installed. So the gap is actually not that hard to bridge. And like the first part of the answer is that there was a lack of technology, not just a lack of will to adopt or structure to adopt. And now that's changed. Mm-hmm. Very briefly on like the second aspect, I do think that everything that, you can't really mandate productivity. Singapore tried, a few places tried and saying, oh, you have to do like BIM to this level. And, France have the same, and like people, they do everything so that the letter of the law is respected, but the spirit of the law is not. And so what I think is going to happen with environmental regulations is that it's putting such a strain on general contractors, developers, subcontractors, and like different stakeholders in the value chain, that if they actually want to respect the law, meaning in some cases not going to prison, if you're talking about waste management and responsibility around waste, they need to hire 1 or 2 more people per project, which is unfathomable in an environment where margins are sometimes negative, and when they're positive, they're not very high. So you're creating an environment where you say, okay, you can hire 2 people that are going to do a terrible job, or you can use this tool that costs like 50 euros a month. And it's creating this dynamic now where I think because of that environmental pressure that's non-negotiable, you're going to have forced digitization of a lot of the processes, because where money goes, where materials go, there's a carbon impact, and that needs to be reported according to the EU taxonomy and all that, new good stuff. So I think we're at the verge of a revolution on all that, and all the stuff that we tried to do in the last 20 years for advanced productivity and digitization, I think is going to be, the results haven't been extremely impressive, and I think it's going to shift very, very fast in the next few years.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. If there are any follow-on questions, you can immediately ask. We would like to have a conversation also with you. What you pointed on is really important. Regulation and compliance for environmental purposes can also lower the productivity and increase the burden in terms of administration. But on the other hand, we have a Green New Deal. We have to be better. We have to increase production if we want to actually deliver all these projects required to decarbonize the built environment. Are there any follow-on question on this topic, please? Yeah. A microphone, please. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all for this extremely interesting panel. I have a question for Maria that goes, and maybe all of you could answer. It goes a little bit back to your closing slide, which says that, and maybe this question also goes to Daniel. The things we call technologies are ways of building order in our world. So I would like to come back to how are technologies itself already a regulator? No? So instead of just saying, okay, we now have this new regulation and the technologies have to follow to keep up with that regulation, I wonder how, or what would be your take on how the technology itself would regulate, especially in view of governance structures that are enabled by the certain blockchain technologies that previously have not been manageable as such. No? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you,
You
Patrick.
want to go first? I think it's for both
Whatever
of you,
you prefer.
right?
Daniel, if you prefer, you can go first.
No, you please first.
Okay, it's a difficult question, so we are kind of trying to juggle who goes first. Thank you so much. I think it's a very good question. I actually think probably Daniel will have more to say in terms of really the governance model, especially of the blockchain technology we talked about. But I think somehow the message that I tried to convey today in the little input talk that I gave was in a way that technological, let's say, presence in the society cannot be decoupled. I mean, every technology governs, right? So when we say it's building order in the world, it is always embodying a certain kind of governance in itself. For me, what is very important is that I very often also have an impression, so I come from theory and history domain, right? So I work rather with research and kind of critical research. At the same time, especially, I think most of the contributors of this conference come from very practical, let's say, aspect, working very closely also with industries. And they're always kind of, we each have different agendas and how do we, ask these questions. But what I really feel in the end of the day is that both of these sides have a kind of detachment of, what the other side is somehow doing. And I feel also, what I, for instance, very often see is that in the practicing domain, the kind of, let's say, the domain that really ties often to industries, there is a lot of focus on the technological innovation itself, but less also focus on what does this technology actually does in the world, right? So we kind of look into what technology does in the lab, and what technology does, how do we optimize it, and how do we make it a product, and then which kind of economy emerges out of this product. But I think this kind of, I don't know if this answers your question, maybe it's a broad answer, but I think what we really need to start thinking is actually how do technologies govern, because that's also where we as researchers do play a role. I mean, technology in a way does not mean anything if we don't give it a meaning. Blockchain can be at the same time a liberating model to take out banks and, intermediaries which are kind of profiting on transactions. But as I also try to show, it can also kind of lead to another kind of governance practices, right? It really depends who employs technology. So I think, to answer your question, I think it's always the one who designs technology and the one who puts it into practice is the one who should also frame the form of governing, actually, that the technology would employ in a way. And I'm not a proponent of kind of worldview that technology can save complex social issues, but I think that it does definitely play an incredibly important part of our everyday life, and it can really shape a lot of things, in the society. So that's the reason why I also feel that this kind of contextualization of technology within social relations, within political discussion is absolutely necessary. I think governance also kind of comes as part of that debate.
Let's let Daniel also give his perspective.
Yeah,
in terms of autonomous systems, can they regulate themselves and give their own governance?
If you do it right, yes. So I really agree with what Maria says, and I'll just build on it. I think I'll use an example though, because the technology does influence the governance. You have to also think about the objectives of the technology, right? So I think that AI, for example, is very opposed to the objectives of blockchain. They can work together, but for example, the goal of an AI is to be more efficient, to be more productive, to do things in a faster amount of time, maybe a bit more creative. So this is the kind of view, and then that comes with a human and a governance component. On the blockchain side, it's actually going to make things slower. Most blockchain technologies are slower than the processes we have today. But what blockchain does is it enables us to program incentives and governance in a new way. So when you hear somebody tell you about doing something and blockchain is going to make it faster, you should question that. If it's going to if blockchain is promised to help you govern or incentivize something better, that's the right opportunity for blockchain. And the second point I'll make is on governance in general. So we had a physical world, and we didn't have a digital world. And so we had people using paper and managing in-person relationships. And this is the idea of physical labor, and then we also and physical tools, and then you had management and governance theories, right? Now we've moved to a digital world. We have digital tools. What is the digital technology that allows us to govern those digital tools? We can't just rely on human management. I believe human management is incredibly important, but we also need digital management tools. And digital governance tools. And that's what blockchain allows us to do, is to program some of those governance rules so that we can have desirable outcomes and not let technology kind of get away from us. So in some sense, it can be like a technology push. Oh, we have AI, now we need blockchain. I get that feeling, and that feeling of the technologies kind of overcoming us and humans being left out. In the other sense, we see that blockchain enables us to specifically program and think critically about governance, which is something that's very important for the human role. And we also can automate some of that governance through blockchain, but we also can enable different participation incentive systems. I'll leave it at that. So.
Thank you, Daniel. Perhaps we also give Konrad an opportunity, because now it's really interesting. We talk about technology, we talk about governance, and now we have to talk about organizational structures which actually can also embed people. Would be interesting to hear after Konrad, also Daniel, on the autonomous character, on that, whether we still need people. But before that, what would be the perfect governance structure and organizational structure, and what kind of technologies you heard today could be actually embedded in such an organizational structure, like a cooperative and a data platform or service platform?
So when you apply just a calculation tool, I mean, you used to have to do your calculation by hand and by your brain, and then suddenly you had this computer to calculate. And this is a factor of many thousands times faster than if you do it by your own. But now we have to do with this connected work, yeah? It's not just the single work which is speeded up, it's the connection. And these connected networks are extremely more efficient than these not connected networks, where you have many interfaces and of course a problem in transporting data. And so this kind of technology, of course, has a massive impact on any regulation in companies and also in the society, because these kind of networks are, so you put together many people, they work together, and they get much more efficient, yeah. And so you have this kind of concentration processes to these efficient networks. And I think so the regulation also gets much more complex. So it's not just this kind of formal regulation where you had the overview over everything. Our society is getting extremely more complex.
There's a question in the audience. Thank you. Konrad.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's actually really interesting what you say about the connection, and it also ties all of your contributions together in a way, like who is actually involved or who is acknowledged in this economy we're talking about. So there were notions of, we have complex proxies when we talk about environmental consequences of the building industry. We have the inclusion of new actors, which is also interesting from a perspective of law as a legal representative, like Daniel talked about like the house, like new modes of ownership and property. And we have seen also that the rivers can be represented in front of the law as a natural person. So I'm just wondering if all of this can be actually really nicely tied together. So when we talk about who is actually acknowledged in this new construction economy. So I don't know if you can speculate about how this can continue in terms of in terms of who can be accountable for property, for ownership, and how can we overcome maybe proxies which don't work exactly like we intend to. Yeah, maybe.
Whom do you would like to call on?
Good point. I know. I think all of you have actually something to say about this. So I really liked the contribution of Maria. So
maybe you can
start.
Yes, please. Thank you so much for a great question. I think it ties actually a lot to Kathrin's question. No? Somehow it's for me. Maybe just to give one example, right? So when we talk about blockchain and decentralization, right? So we can talk about algorithm. We can talk about, I don't know, the way technology works. We can talk about the way it means practically different things in different contexts. For example, real estate tokenization, the example that I gave is grounded in the kind of paradigm of decentralization, like decentralized circulation of real estate. But the question is really for whom? Because if you would speak about decentralization of housing from the perspective of, let's say, social justice discussions or housing, justice discussion, you would rather think about cooperatives and kind of, equal access to housing for the ones who actually cannot access housing. So I think, I feel that in my opinion, let's say, a lot of my work revolves around the questions of language and media, and I think there is a kind of necessity of translation also of, let's say, different scales and different contexts in which these words mean something completely else. So I think, I don't know if there is an answer to your question, but I feel my answer would be rather that these translations right now feel a bit lost, and there is a kind of discommunication, between everyone is appropriating the term in the way they want to kind of use it, right? So I think that is actually where, the next step could be also in kind of thinking across contexts for all the stakeholders somehow involved in the process.
Maybe thanks first for your inspiring talk. A follow-up question for Daniel. If you say we can create like assets that are their own agents, how we deal with liability? Like if it's human created, do we then still have, I don't know, a corrupt corporation that is liable for what the autonomous house is doing or the car? And especially if you say that with your blockchain tools, we can like create housing into more public goods. Is this then the state or is it the machine itself?
Great question. Let me just say, when we started working on the project, we did it from a technical perspective. Can this be done? Can we make a house that runs on the blockchain? And then we realized that was actually the most boring question. The most interesting question is all these questions around ownership, legal, and what this paradigm shift could possibly look like. From the legal perspective, there are different maybe opinions that thoughts we've had. I mostly think what will happen is that the house will have a treasury. It has a treasury now, and that treasury can be used to purchase insurance. And that insurance can be from a third party, from an insurance provider, which will insure against liability. I think the same thing for public, if we think of algorithms as public goods, then we could think about if algorithm makes a design mistake, will it be insured for its liability in doing that? It's kind of a radical view, but I also don't see another alternative, for example, other than having, because SMEs are not going to be using AI and being okay with the liability there. So it will only be large corporations that can afford it. So those are kind of the two alternatives that I see when you think about insurance. Yeah, there's my answer. I don't know if you agree. But
Michael, we have to build prisons for these machines.
Good. Exactly. And I would like to follow up exactly on that. We had the discussion before. The hope of all these technologies was to introduce transparency into real estate markets, for example, to democratize currencies. But what we saw, and this is aligned with academics like Nouriel Roubini, who is saying this is 99% of all this in terms of cryptocurrencies is a scam, right? But still, the interesting thing of Nouriel Roubini is that he's also investing in the right and the more ethical applications of these new technologies. And you mentioned also in a discussion before that the story is very important. Narratives economics. So we have to tell a story why this will work, because all markets are based on stories and narratives, especially if you use very complicated technology where 99% of the actors don't actually understand the technology. How can they trust the technology? What is your take on that?
Yeah, that's I think it's an incredibly important discussion. I mean, there is a kind of economy of attention, no? That is also somehow. I always like to return to the work of an anthropologist that shaped a lot of our research, Anat Singh, who also very often kind of mentions that startups and kind of venture capitalists, they need to imagine profit and kind of communicate these, let's say, futures of profit before it actually takes place. So I think when it comes to technologies like blockchain, which actually claim to solve a lot of social dilemmas, or even another example, I was this year I was a co-curator of I still am a co-curator because the exhibition is still on, of Luxembourg Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and we did a research on space mining industry. So we also looked into how, for example, there is an entire economy in a way evolving around narratives, language, and storytelling. It's really a storytelling project about a kind of perspective vision of resources and growth that is potentially to take place. I mean, like there are many disagreements whether in 20 years or 100 years or never, but there is a kind of fictional point in the future on which actually very concrete, very tangible industries operate today. For instance, in Luxembourg, in the US, in Japan, in the United Arab Emirates and other countries whose legal structures followed, in a way, kind of these technology kind of visions, right? So I think there is, I think here it's just also very important when we talk about technologies, like, for instance, blockchain, or I think now potentially even AI, right? This is a kind of the latest also buzzword. I mean, it's of course a very legitimate sphere of practice, but also kind of, you can see that the media, in a way, becomes a space that is not merely communicating the innovation, but becomes a space that kind of also precedes the innovation itself, where somehow the value, economic value, is being generated. And I think, I mean, for me, this is also, as a kind of researcher who works in this domain, I think we kind of almost need to change the methodology of working with all these different clusters together. No, like how to talk about speculative economy in the production of the built environment. I think it becomes a very important research and also pedagogical question, let's say, also at the university.
As you can see, the discussion has just started, right? Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so we are already over time. I would like to thank all the speakers for their contribution and for the interesting discussion. And we could have discussed 2 more hours, I'm sure, and we have left behind a lot of information gaps. So there is a large need to continue that discussion because it will affect all of us. And with that, I would like to close the discussion and also give a hand of applause to our guests online. Thank you.